So, Bill, thank you for joining us and being a test case for us on this new podcast that we call Looking for America. I'm really intrigued to talk to you a little bit because you come from the Midwest. You live in Florida now. So you've seen the great United States, and you know, as we're looking for America, we're trying to understand where did it go? What we knew has disappeared. Can we find it again? So your perspective, I want to know a little bit about where do you come from politically, and how would you tell me, where do you sit on the political spectrum?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here to be your test subject. Coming through the Midwest, I was born into a Republican family. Definitely followed the Republican values. You know, it was the Reagan administration and all that buzz. It was an exciting time. You know, it's strange looking at now having an assassination attempt on Reagan, same way that we've had recently. But over time, you know, as I grew up, I definitely had a pull towards the middle, especially socially. Those issues, it seemed to make sense that we needed to kind of push away from some of the censorship and the things that were going on when I was younger, and this idea that we wanted to control everyone, from everything from what they said to what they were doing in their bedroom and all of that. And it just didn't feel like freedom. And so over time, I kind of became more of a libertarian than anything. Sure. Slowly gravitated that way. You know, at first I would always say I was a fiscal conservative and a social liberal. And I think that identified a lot of the people that I was around coming through. I think it identified what was middle America at the time.
Gotcha.
And, you know, I hope we can find America too. I think it lives in all of us. I think when we look back about how we went through our lives as a community, working together, even though people had different voting preferences, we were all still together. We were all still one. We were all citizens of the same United States. And I think we all wanted the same things for our kids, for our families, for our future. Safety. We wanted to be able to chase whatever dream we had. And I think over time that's just gotten what seems like further and further away from reality, especially when we talk to our kids. I think our kids don't have that same positive outlook on things. And I think it has to do with how they look at the world so differently than we do, and look at their future with much less hope than we had.
Now, you mentioned that earlier when I was talking to you that you are a fan of Robert Kennedy and his campaign for the presidency. And this is going to be a very interesting presidential election because you'll have the traditional Republican that is represented by the former president, Donald Trump. You now have the vice president, Kamala Harris, has now moved up to the top of the ticket with Joe Biden stepping out, which is historically significant in its own right. And then you've got this independent candidate, among others, Robert Kennedy, who's pulling at about 9 or 10% right now. Tell me what you see there with Kennedy's campaign.
I think I see someone who was abandoned by their party, a traditional Democrat who's been fighting against corruption. You know, a lot of time spent attacking, you know, environmental issues, big pharma, all of those things that we've learned over the last few years that have been such a problem. And he's gone and he's fought those and he's won. And because some of those issues don't align perfectly with what I would say the corporate captured left, he's kind of ostracized. And it's interesting watching the Democratic National Committee kind of trying to find the right direction forward when they basically pushed somebody out and kept them out, where if they had gone through their own process of finding their candidate, it might have been a little bit different. And I think that's one of the big problems is, as voters, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, there are times when you feel like your vote is almost nullified. And I don't always think that's an accident. I think there's a lot of strategies involved in avoiding some of those situations where you get someone in that might not be controllable. And I have a definite draw to the independent, like yourself, where you're divorcing yourself from the ideology of a party and that commitment to a party before country that I think is part of the capture that's there. As long as those parties are there and they're controlled, and from a financial perspective, I think one of the worst things that happened in our country was when we started allowing corporations to donate to campaigns. And when that happened, it just opened the doors, and the money has gone out of control. And it makes it impossible for someone like you, what seems like impossible, to get your footing, to get even on ballots, and to get the time on the media to be able to state your case, to put yourself out there, to allow people to even understand that you're there. And I think that is, something that has to be fixed. If we're going to find our way back, it has to represent the people, and it has to stop representing the corporations. And we're not good at speaking with our dollars. We buy the most convenient thing. We purchase the hottest product, and we do it the cheapest, fastest way. I mean, how much I buy on Amazon is just crazy from the way it used to be. And so we're not doing a good job of using our dollars to put it where it needs to go. And they make it very difficult to do so, especially when the banks have control of those things too. So, how do we make our way through? And I think one of those things is breaking those ties, and trying to get that out of the system.
Doing something different. Well, you mentioned Ronald Reagan, and it's interesting because earlier in my career, I worked in Washington on congressional staff in the House and the Senate. I was there during the Reagan administration, and I was, for 36, 37 years, I was a Democrat. For the last 12 or 13 years, I've been an independent. But we used to fight with Reagan tooth and nail, but we disagreed on the issues. The personalities were still good. He was friendly, he was fun, he was engaging. He and Tip O'Neill, you heard the old stories, how they'd get together, they'd have a drink, they'd, trade the Irish folk stories all the time.
Yep.
But we would fight him on a lot of the issues. I don't know about you, but when I look at the Reagan presidency today, I actually miss Reagan's days, because he would tell you what he believed in and then he would fight for it, and you had to respect that. That's right. Today, politicians will tell you something and they'll do completely the opposite. Doesn't seem to be the same ethics that were there. Tell me a little bit about your like of the Reagan administration, and what do you think he would think now if he were watching what we're doing today?
I think what I liked about what he did is a lot about what you said. It was, he was who he said he was. It felt like at the time. I mean, look back. I mean, there were some issues there that I didn't understand at the time, with some of the things internationally. But as a people, there was a pride in our country. There was a way forward. There was a push. He was trying to break down the wall. What he did with Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, and in breaking that down, I think that was incredibly significant. And it gets dismissed because maybe his other policies were not what people would have wanted them to be at the time. But he did work across the aisle. I think that was the way that business was done. I think you could look at legislatively how things operated at that time, and it was very much as the founding fathers saw it. You could bring a bill, you could amend a bill, you could vote on the bill. You had time to review those bills. One of my favorite politicians, I've got a couple, Justin Amash, he's running for Senate now in Michigan. And he was a representative, I think, up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. But one of the things he always did is he would use social media, and he would put out why he voted one way or another. He would explain it right when it happened. And he actively fought against some of the processes that were broken in Congress, whether it was the House or the Senate. And a lot of it came down to things that like Paul Ryan changed, where you couldn't make those amendments. You couldn't. There were who's writing the bills,
Right.
and then you bring these giant omnibus bills that are full of, dozens and dozens of issues, and they get tagged with a title of something that sounds fantastic. Meanwhile, the majority of that bill does harm in another way or is a completely different direction from that, and they just take kind of the flavor of the day and title it and push it through, and anybody that votes against it, you're anti this, anti that, when really what they're doing is they're voting against little pieces of it and saying, I'm not willing to let that go.
Right.
When we look at what happened at 9/11 and the reactions to it, the push for more spying on Americans, and breaking down some of those rules that existed, I think Reagan would look at that stuff and just I think he would cower. I think he would just be so disappointed that it's not being done in a transparent, honest manner.
Sure.
And I might be wrong about what he would have thought by any means, but it just seemed like the what do I want to say, the tone of the time was definitely not that of secrecy and underhanded moves behind the scenes,
Sure.
pushing. I think that's what we want to see get out. And everybody that I talk to, they have trouble arguing against those points.
Right.
But, it's always, well, we're never going to change that. So they just got to do business the way business is done.
Right.
I'm not willing to accept that. I don't think any of us should be willing to accept that.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's interesting going back to those days with the Reagan administration and when I was in Washington. I worked for 3 different people that were really extraordinary and I would call legacy people. One was Bill Nelson, who's now our NASA administrator, served in the U.S. Senate from Florida for a lot of years. I learned a lot about politics from him, and he was highly ethical, very, very determined to be a public servant. Worked for Lawton Chiles. Lawton Chiles was a U.S. Senator, later governor of Florida, known for walking the state, was real down to earth, easy to talk to, brilliant in legislative strategy. And then I worked for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. John Dingell of Michigan was the chair. Jim Florio of New Jersey, later Governor Florio, was one of the subcommittee chairs I got to work with. And it's interesting because we were working on immigration reform all the way back then. Nothing's changed. We're still working on immigration reform. It hasn't happened. It's been 30, coming up on 40 years that we haven't resolved a problem that we've known this country has had forever. It drives you crazy.
It does.
And it's exactly, along the lines of what you're talking about, which is the tenor and the tone have changed. We fight, but we don't get anything done anymore.
Yeah.
There's nothing to show for work product that comes out of the fights that we're having with each other.
It's interesting that there are some issues that just tend to stay in that spot, right? Just the never-ending discussion and the pull back and forth. It seems like there's always enough power to pull it one way or the other at certain times, but it never quite gets pulled.
Never quite gets, yeah.
So I'm interested in how do you see your role in being able to approach that part of it to say, we want to get to a solution and actually make it fit, make it work, and try to stop the forever discussion of those issues. I think that's something that's always bothered me in politics is we're always talking about these hot buttons whenever the election comes around, and then those issues disappear afterwards, and nobody moves on it.
So I've taken a multi-project approach to it. A few years ago, I wrote a political novel called Hoya, The Watchman Waketh. And it was kind of a wake-up call for me as I was writing this book, because it's a political novel, but it was based on a speech that John Kennedy was going to give at the Dallas Trade Mart on the day he was assassinated. And in that speech, he called it the Watchman Waketh speech. He was warning us that we have to be very concerned about our security, not only from abroad, but what's happening to us from within the country. That was 1963. And if it hasn't come front and center, I don't know what else has. From there, I then launched a multimedia magazine that I call Thomas. It's designed to talk about some of the issues, particularly from an independent perspective. And then I decided I was going to run for office. And it was a last-minute decision. My wife and I really talked over, should we not? But given the stakes of what's going on in this election, I decided, okay, I'm going to jump in. Well, in jumping in, one of the questions that came up was why are you an independent, and what does an independent do? There's no infrastructure. You don't have the party support you get as a Democrat or Republican. We have lots of independent parties who sometimes do work together, sometimes don't work together. How do you get them to come together? So we created a new political party called the 21st Century Democratic Republican Party. That is based on a party that existed in 1792 when Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and James Madison, the father of our Constitution, got together and created this party to try to advance what they believed we needed in America today. And so we decided we're going to take that party, we're going to recreate it or refound it, and we're going to use it as a vehicle to start to build that infrastructure. In building the infrastructure, then we can start to have the things that parties don't. But we wanted a broad-based approach to it, and we want a collaborative base to it. So we'll work with the Green Party, we'll work with libertarians, we'll work with anybody to try to advance more independent thinking. And then finally, we created a super PAC, the Looking for America super PAC, not designed to be involved in the races per se, like my race, but looking at the issue more broadly, which is what is America, where did America go, and how do we get America back that we know to be the America we want, the America that we love. A place where there isn't discrimination, a place where you can balance the budget, where you can have a good, safe home and neighborhood, where your kids can go to school, where you can get health care, the things that Americans have a right to expect. And so for me, the biggest challenge in all of this was how do you put those pieces together so that you have a comprehensive approach? And in doing so, then you can compete. You can compete against the other parties. You can compete against the naysayers. You can compete against the obstructionists and the extremists. That's got to go away. And it's time for us, as you said earlier, it's time for us to be one. From really one, there's many. That's us, and that's who we've always been, and that's who we've got to be again. So I'm working toward that, and I'm using these resources to make those things happen. And we're just getting started.
Yep, it's a beautiful idea. It sounds like exactly what I think so many people have been looking for, is that representation of such a large group of people in lieu of picking which side you want to lean over to. I don't know many people that feel 100% represented.
Right.
And that goes local all the way to national. I can say that one of my weaknesses is the time that I'm able to spend looking at politics. I don't spend enough on local. I think we get bombarded with the amount of information when it comes to the national spotlight and trying to find solutions for all of our problems, with dictating the same thing for New York City as Omaha, Nebraska. And that's something that's never worked. I think when you go back to, Jeffersonian ideas, the idea of power back to the states is something that we have to look hard at again.
Sure.
I think there's been some moves recently that are positive moves that maybe don't feel as positive, but I think re-empowering the states and having the federal government being more of a representation of all of those states working together is something that could make us more powerful overall and more representative of individuals within those areas that can make us a better country overall. I think the idea that one set of rules for everybody from top to bottom, when people are just different, the regions are different, people's ideas of how they want to live are different. It's hard to make all those things fit, and it creates animosity towards other areas when there shouldn't be.
When there shouldn't
be.
So let me put a couple questions to you, just to kind of put you on the spot a few things.
Go for it. So
where do you get your best news from? What source do you go to the most?
It's very much independent media. I've been very happy with the changes to Twitter and being able to open up the free speech arena and being able to hear different ideas. I think it's incumbent on all of us as citizens to be able to take in information from a lot of different places. So I listen to a ton of different podcasts. And I try to go outside of my political spectrum and listen to things that I might not agree with, the people that are interviewing people that I may not align with. And I want to understand what they're talking about, why they see things differently than we do, or than I do. I shouldn't say we. But, I think getting a taste of all of that and understanding different perspectives can broaden how you look at things, and also understand people as being not evil and not a threat to democracy, and actually be the same human beings that I'm living next to. Yeah, this guy's got this flag on his porch. This guy's got this flag on his porch, and there's very little difference in what we want. I think people want to be free. I think some people maybe have a problem with not having enough rules, but I think for the most part, we want freedom. We want freedom. We want prosperity. We want to be able to do what we want to do, travel, go where we want to go, and we want that for everyone.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes the thing that's interesting is kind of how you approach that and whose responsibility that is often the difference of how people sit politically. If I feel like it's the government's responsibility to provide those things to me, I'm going to look at things a little bit differently. If I feel like that's something that I've got to be responsible and accountable for, I'm probably going to look at things a little bit differently than the other way. So kind of understanding those differences and how people approach things is a much easier way to be able to talk across the aisle or across the gaps, and be able to reach a consensus about how to do things. But you have to respect the people you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
And the only way to have that respect is for there to be transparency, honesty, consistency. The flip-flopping is something, and that it's so frustrating when you are watching the process move ahead in government, and whatever the issue is. I mean, you can pick it, but watching the sides kind of bounce back and forth, this side, the other side. I mean, the left used to fight for free speech.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now that's totally, it feels like it's completely flip-flopped. It doesn't make sense.
No.
Your history, I can't wait. I really want to read your book on the JFK speech. That sounds very intriguing. I can tell you one of the things that skewed me kind of to question government was researching the JFK assassination. My brother got into it. It was the time when the movie came out, JFK, and and kind of questioning all the things that happened around that. And I've always been interested in that. And listening to RFK talk about it, RFK Jr.
Yeah, he's
talk about it personally.
About it lately,
he sure does. He knows quite a bit. It does make you look at how those, the gears of government turn and what's going on, behind the scenes, and makes you question intentions and those things. And so I'm real interested to hear from you. Just like you asked me about Reagan, how do you think JFK would feel about what's going on today?
It's kind of interesting because I kind of think of myself as a little bit of a JFK scholar. I've really studied his presidency over the years. I went to Georgetown University in American government, was a university fellow, and that was one of the presidencies that I really spent a lot of time on. I don't think Kennedy could get the nomination to be the Democratic standard bearer of his party today. I don't think Thomas Jefferson could either. I don't even think Ronald Reagan would be able to get the Republican nomination today. And that's an extraordinary thing to believe, that those iconic members of the presidential family would not be able to be president for our country. I don't like where that means we've gone. I think Kennedy would be very disappointed in the fact that we can't all get along together. I think he'd be concerned about the security issue that we talked about earlier, that there's too many threats from within in addition to the threats that we have from outside. An isolationist period that we might go into if another person gets elected president of the United States is not a good place for the United States to go. We've not been successful as an isolationist country. So in all of those cases, I really don't think Kennedy would be happy with it. I don't think Jefferson and Madison would be happy with it, or George Washington, or any of the founding fathers, because we're moving too far from where we are as a nation and where we need to be. When we can't even take care of our own people, we don't have a right to tell others how to behave or what to do. And I think they would tell us, take care of your own people first, keep an eye on our foreign shores, work with the rest of the world, but don't become insular. Don't become isolationist. Don't roll up the welcome carpet. We're a nation of immigrants. Immigration built this nation. We should have a path to citizenship for anybody that wants to come to the United States. Do we open the border and just let them walk in? No, of course not. If they're here illegally, we've got to find a way to make them legal. We can't deport 11 million people. It's not practical. But by the same token, we can't give them blanket amnesty either. I don't think Kennedy would support that either. His Alliance for Progress was a great program. Space exploration, a great program. What he did with taxes and business and government being something that we could be excited about. I think he would be he'd be beating his head against the wall trying to make that happen again.
Yeah, I think the little bit I know of the policies that he was pushing when he was taken out, the things that he wanted to change, I think they would have made us a different place. I kind of point to that time as one of the key moments where we went in the wrong direction.
Right.
And I feel sometimes like we are still beholden to the controls that allowed that to happen.
Right.
And we've never been able to break that. And that makes me sad and scared for the future when because it's hard to imagine being able to fix that. When you said on immigration, it's an interesting topic, and I think it's become such an emergency.
Sure.
When we've discussed it in the past, it's been more theoretical. It's been more adjustments. But like you said, it's never been completely solved. But you mentioned take care of your people first. And then, knowing that in the isolationism, I feel like that's a very fine line. And part of it is when you're looking at what could be versus what is or what has been. I'm starting to sound like one of the other candidates a little bit. Sometimes I feel like there's a desire to label each side of that as being either wide open or shut down the country as a whole. And that isolationism, I feel like that feels, it almost feels like a little bit of a gaslight. Right? Where if we're going to take care of our people first and saying America first, that feels like the right thing to do. And it may be temporary, but it's not necessarily it's not a binary situation again. And whenever we want to kind of push one way or the other, and I think it's natural when you're trying to pick who you're going to vote for, everything seems so binary.
Right.
You're either on this side or this side. But I think there is a happy medium in there. I think there's a place where we can be where we can prioritize something without ignoring the other.
That's exactly right.
So, and I think that's the push and pull and the going across the aisle that needs to happen. How do you I understand your position as an independent
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to go in there. How can you make that machine work that way when sometimes it feels like that's only
That's right.
one machine?
Right.
You actually feel like you've got to break it
That's right.
to get it to do anything other than it does.
Yeah. I don't think you have to break it to make it work. I think you got to nudge it pretty hard. One of the things that we've done as a political party in creating the 21st Century Democratic Republican Party is we've adopted the rhino as our mascot. And the reason for that is there's a guy by the name of Sir Paul Johnson, who's a British historian, who wrote an article in Forbes a number of years ago. And in it, he said that when we're dealing with crises, we all should start to act like a rhino does. In a crisis, a rhino will do one of two things. One, it's very determined what it does. One, it will either make a lot of noise and scare you out of the way, or two, it's going to put its horn down and it's just going to run over you. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where our politics needs to be. We need to make a lot of noise and get people scared into action, that we've got to do something. And if they won't, then we've just got to act. We've got to make something happen. And in doing that, we have to be mindful that we're going to have to nudge it back to the center. We're going to have to, we may try to do something comprehensively, but you're going to constantly have to adapt it as you go to make it better, to continue to improve it. Nothing that is done legislatively or in law has to be the final thing. Mm-hmm. So if we don't get it right, we can keep trying to get it right. Mm-hmm. And if we do that, then we're going to be more successful at getting people to talk across the aisle, to work together to try to find a solution. And I'll tell you, with immigration reform, I've got this idea of what I think that needs to be, but I recognize that in the end, it will have to settle somewhere different than where I want it to go. Probably not as far as I'd like it to go, but at least it will be something that we got done. And it's something that we can work on and we can continue to improve over a period of time. Nice. I think that's the trick right now in D.C.
Good. Are you concerned about that name being a reference to a label made to some
Heck no, I like it. In fact, I tell people, not only are we trying to attract independents, but we're also trying to attract what I'll call reforming Democrats and Republicans. I want rhinos, R-I-N-O, rhinos as in Republicans in name only. They're welcome to join our party. We'd love to have them, especially now when they might not feel like they have anybody representing them in their own party extremes. Same thing with the Dinos, by the way. Democrats in name only. Welcome, come on, join our party. That's why we have both names in our party name.
Well, that's good. How would you describe, or maybe give me background on how the Democratic Party left you?
Sure. So I think the Democratic Party, I was involved as a Southern Democrat, so we were always kind of moderate to begin with. Mm-hmm. And over time, the party has obviously moved much farther to the left, to the degree that I think a lot of people are being excluded from having their opportunity to be represented by the party. For me, wanting more moderation, more inclusiveness, more collaboration, that disappeared. The party was not interested in that. And I was finding myself more and more as I was advocating on certain things that I was being told, no, it's not progressive enough. Mm-hmm. I don't look down on somebody who is progressive. I welcome them and their perspective. What I didn't like is that my perspective was starting to be ignored, discounted. Mm-hmm. I wanted them to think of me as somebody that was trying to improve that process like we were talking about, and that wasn't happening.
Interesting. It feels like the idea of the bullying, that I like to call it bullying, because I really feel like that's what it is you don't get a say unless you agree on these items. It's kind of like those omnibus bills, right?
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
You're either voting yes or no on this, and you're going to vote. When you vote yes, you're voting yes to all of these
I
things.
would like to see us have bills where we stand alone on the topic that's being dealt with. I don't like the big trains where everything gets thrown in and you either vote for it or you don't, but you can't have the things that you want. That's got to change. We've got to get back to legislating, and we've got to deal with individual bills, and we need to get the work done.
Who do you see in the Senate that you're moving into? Who do you see in the individual parties that can be a leader there, that can bring that kind of discipline to the legislative process?
So I'll tell you, it's kind of funny that I've been thinking about this scenario that it's going to be a very close election no matter how you look at it. It's conceivable that the Democrats and the Republicans will be 50-50 again. If I can flip Florida purple, it's no longer 50-50. The question would be, who would I want to caucus with? And right now, I'll tell you, if I'm going to caucus with anybody, I'm probably going to caucus with the independents. There might be 2 or 3 or 4 of us, but I'm not willing to become a part of another party just to get a committee assignment.
Right.
With that said, what I would like to see is the Democrats and Republicans, neither one in the Senate, being able to have absolute control of the Senate. I would like to see Angus King, who is the independent senator from Maine, former governor, very moderate, very responsive and responsible. I'd like to see him be the Senate Majority Leader and then bridge the gap between the Democrats and the Republicans who want it so bad but might not be able to get it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stake. For an independent to win Florida, to stop Rick Scott from being the Senate Majority Leader as an example, there's a lot at stake for us to try to get that done.
Understood. So you mentioned running against Rick Scott. What about Debbie Marcusel Powell?
So running against Debbie or running against Rick really isn't my priority. I'm running for the United States Senate, a very active agenda that I want to accomplish. It just so happens that Rick is the incumbent, and Debbie is challenging him and running against him. I think the reality in Florida is, Debbie has got a tough road to go. Democrats have not been very popular in the state of Florida in the last number of elections. Nothing's changed. In fact, Republicans now have a 1 million vote advantage over Democrats. Independents, we're not that far behind. But Debbie also is in favor of and has voted in the past as a one-term congresswoman to give blanket amnesty to illegal aliens, illegal immigrants. The problem with that is in Central and North Florida, they're much more moderate and much more conservative. That's not going to play well. So I don't think she has the ability to win the state of Florida. And then, of course, you got Rick Scott. And Rick Scott's got a lot of issues that are working against him. He's wanting to cut Social Security and Medicare benefits for seniors. That's not good. He's against being able to make immigration reform happen. He says he wants it, but he just voted to block it the other day in the Senate. That's not good. He wants to be able to deny climate change as a real issue that needs to be looked at. That's not good. So if you look at some of the things he's doing, in addition to how he's trying to prevent women from making their own choices about their health care, these are not things that are going to get you elected to the U.S. Senate. So I think there is a golden opportunity for an unknown independent like myself to come out of the woodwork in the last 3 months of this campaign and take it by surprise.
One of the things you mentioned was voting rights.
Yes.
And just thinking about it, I think this is one of the big issues I know as me as an independent, have concerns about the integrity of voting. And I think it's become such a high priority and an immediate fix to something that we feel that we're being disenfranchised. And of course, immigration plays into that. But it's always been a line that's been difficult to define. Where do you stand on voting laws and bringing back that integrity to the voting process?
So I think voting is the most important thing we can do as citizens. And clearly, that's what the Constitution was predicated on by the Founding Fathers. It's something that we need to embrace and hold dear to our hearts. It doesn't need to be that difficult to give people an opportunity to vote. A national election day that's actually a holiday might be a great idea. Having a voter ID of some type, like your driver's license, seems like to me common sense. Easy to prove, you are who you are. But if you do that, if you give somebody an ID requirement and they can prove who they are, let them vote. Let them get registered. Give them time to vote. Do absentee voting, because our secretaries of state, our division election chiefs in each of the counties are more than capable of being able to prove that this person should be voting for this particular election. Give them that opportunity. By the same token, I think we got to do everything we can to prevent the allegations that there's any kind of fraud in the election process. I'm one who doesn't believe that there was a lot of fraud in the last election. To the contrary, I think it was a very sound election. Yeah, there were little problems here and little problems there, but nothing that would have affected the outcome of that race in 2020. we need to stay away from that. We have got to find ways to make sure that there's a trail to see that if this person came, presented themselves, and they voted, this was a person who should vote, and their vote was counted. That's critically important to American elections.
I know recently there's been things that have come out of Wisconsin and Michigan concerning large number of ballots that do not have validated signatures, and they are of amounts that were relatively significant. Also Georgia, I believe, if my memory is correct, which it's not always the most reliable.
Sure.
I think that's one spot where I have concerns, especially with the voting machines and the vulnerability that we have. We were told that they're never online, they're not on the internet, they're not connected. Yet the CrowdStrike breakdown that just happened this past week affected machines in Maricopa County in Arizona and some other locations where we were told it was not online. It clearly is online, and it's another spot where it's like, wait, that doesn't make sense. You know, what is reality? Do you see a benefit to regain that integrity, to move towards more of an old style paper ballot only, restricting the absentee ballots to an extent where there's a recorded process of who requests those, and not just being able to blanket everybody gets one and you can choose to use it or not? Does that sound like something that would make sense to kind of simplify and get people back to having faith in that process, and then moving back to greater technology as we can get some, blockchain technology to tie to those voting records and those things to...
In today's technology, that capability is there across the board. You can do paper, you can have a trail, and they can also be done electronically so that we can speed up the results of who did or didn't win on any given election night. The idea that it takes days, weeks, and months now to figure that out is absolutely crazy and insane, and there's no logical, rational reason for that to be the case. I would like to see a trail. I would like to see people have to attest to the fact that this is their ballot. Maybe you have them sign that ballot before they submit it to the machine that does feed it. But by the same token, we have to have elected officials who are looking over that process, who say, this is a true ballot, this is a true read, and yes, the machines are online, or no, the machines are not online, and tell us the truth. There's no reason to hide that. One of the other things that I think is also critically important in our elections is we have to be able to trust the system, period. And that system hasn't been trustable. Now, in the case of the Georgia that you talk about, Georgia's an interesting case because Brad Raffensperger was a Republican Secretary of State. And this was a Republican race for president that was supposedly affected. I have no way of knowing whether it did or it didn't happen. We're 4 years past that. We're into a whole nother presidential election season. But I would doubt that a Republican Secretary of State would have allowed a bunch of fake ballots to take place in that particular state. Now, take a state like Michigan, I don't know. Take a state that is democratically controlled, I don't know. But we have to move on beyond that and try to have an election this time around that is sane, that is solid, and that there aren't those allegations that it's been stolen by one party or the other.
I think the one place where I push back a little bit there is when you talk about Georgia, as someone who's been an independent for a while, and you have too, but running in that space, I think you have to be careful to assume that within a party that everyone's working together. I think what we've seen with Trump and his administration and his battle to be on the ballot, et cetera, no matter which side you see it from, there are certainly people within the Republican Party, might be some of those rhinos that we mentioned earlier, that do not want him in.
Right. There is. Sure.
The establishment versus the outsider, and however you want to see it. I think believing that, and I think that's what draws people to him, is that he is seen as an outsider. I'm not convinced that he is an outsider. It might look that way. But I think that when we're analyzing things and we're talking about motives of why people are doing things, I always think that that's one of the spots where we get into a gray area that's impossible to defend.
Right.
And really, we have to look at the actions that someone takes.
Mm-hmm.
Where have they been? What have they done?
Mm-hmm.
What's their record? Some people stand on whatever podium is put in front of them, and they'll read whatever line
They'll say whatever you
is
want to
there.
hear. Yeah, sure.
And then they'll go and they'll do something completely different. And they might change their stance even on their votes based on whoever's put money in their pocket. And I think to try to be outside of that, you've got to be principled. You've got to be diligent about facts, diligent about transparency.
Right.
The stuff that's happened over the last 2 weeks, I think, is the greatest example of the need for transparency. The transparency in the investigation of the assassination attempt.
Sure.
The transparency in what's going on with Joe Biden and his resignation. The transparency about what's been going on with him for the past, I think people that are looking at independent media would say, the last at least 2 years. Sure. Where they've seen that decline. And wondering, how did this stay undercover? How are they doing this without us knowing? And who is actually pulling these strings? Who's behind some of these things, and what's really happening, and why these things happen? I think if there's a place that the government has failed, is being able to trust the public with information that maybe the serfs can't quite handle.
Sure. Yeah.
And that feeling of being incapable and trust the experts. If there's anything that's broken my trust in that, it's since 2019 has been that piece.
Right.
Trust us. We're going to tell you what you need to know.
Sure.
That can't be. I think the swell of social media, the swell of independence, the podcast power that now exists is a direct result of that. How do you tap into that and use that to get to where you need to be?
So I think you just made the case for why independents are important to the political process. No question about it.
Did I tee it up?
Because, you teed it up beautifully, and I love it. Because the fact of the matter is, let's just use the election as an example. I don't know that I could go back and fix all of the problems that led up to it. But one of the ways that you can fix it and start to create a solution is you take the Federal Elections Commission, which right now is, I believe, if I remember correctly, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, and they're all never getting anything done because it's 3 and 3. Add 3 independents to that group of people and make it 9. And I would make the argument that the Democrats in this country make up about a third of the country. The Republicans make up about a third of the country's voters as well, and the independents make up about a third of the country's voters as well. Actually, polling shows that independents are really running at about 40 or 42%.
Correct.
We are now the party in the United States if we were organized as a party. Seems to me 3, 3, and 3 would get you to somewhere, and you wouldn't be able to have a 3 and 3 tie break.
Yeah.
So
Makes a
you
lot
got
of
9,
sense.
not 6. It's an odd number, not an even
The
number.
math works.
So that's a solution that, again, I think what we're missing in all of this is we all talk about the problems. We can all point. We can all have the conspiracy theories, but nobody does anything to get something done to fix it.
Very good.
Classic example of there's a fix. So I think that needs to be done. The other thing, too, that I learned long ago in politics is don't pay attention to what they say. Pay attention to what they do.
That's correct.
And I think we in the media, I think we in the voting public, I think we in elected office need to start asking those hard questions a lot more. There are certainly questions going on about what happened with the assassination in the Secret Service. I mean, when John Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, it was from a higher point in about the same amount of space that Donald Trump was from the roof of that building in Pennsylvania. That's never happened before. They have always guarded those roofs. Why did it fail this time? That doesn't make any sense. Why could the head of the Secret Service, who I actually supported being kicked out of office, why was that person not able to answer any of Congress's questions about what happened and what we know? Democrat and Republican alike. This was a bipartisan group of people that were trying to get to answers that she could not answer.
It really feels like that congressional hearing. In some ways, I detest those hearings because they're so rare that they actually get answers that matter. It was so strange that it was such a unified, bipartisan. It was probably the most bipartisan thing I've seen out of the government in, 10 years at least.
Right.
To see that happen, and the questions were valid.
Right.
And they do deserve answers. What's your opinion of these congressional hearings and how they seem to have become soft? They seem to have become something that you're not really required to come to. DHS, FBI, CIA all refuse the next day to even show up. How do we deal with that? It seems like an important part of the process.
It's a very important part of the process. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of these congressional hearings have been so soft is they've become too partisan. They've become witch hunts for one side or the other on the politics. It's become gotcha. That needs to go away. The business of congressional hearings is to get to the bottom of an issue. And it's also to propose what is the solution to that issue. We don't get to the bottom of those issues anymore, and we don't propose a solution anymore. That's got to change. And I think that's where an independent can nudge that process along a little bit better by helping to ask the questions or encourage the questions to be there, and then offering specific legislative solutions that will make that happen. When I was in Washington, I spent 4 years working for the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I was on professional staff. I got to be one of those people that would sit on the back of the dais, and I would actually whisper in the boss's ear and would suggest questions that he could ask. I could also help him find answers to things that he wanted to know that we couldn't get there. And we worked on these issues all day long and all night long. Really dedicated group of people that knew what they were doing and did try to work hard to come up with solutions. I also had the opportunity to be one of those subcommittee press secretaries. So I got to talk to the media and explain to them what we thought was going on at the committee level. A lot of times you could share information that didn't necessarily come out, but was along the lines of what we were investigating. And we dealt with a lot of really big issues. That particular committee, 40% of all the legislation that went through Congress went through that committee at some point. So that process needs to come back. It needs to run more smoothly, and it needs to be a whole lot less political in terms of its purposes. If we do that, we can start to get to the bottom of some of these issues.
So would you say that is part of the forming of the legislation that has been taken away
yeah,
from Congress?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of goes back to what I was kind of hinting at earlier of these omnibus bills that are written by outside agencies, outside lobbyists, and just doesn't seem to represent our representatives who represent us.
Well, another example is how do we handle the budget each year? It used to be that you dealt with each agency individually, you did their budgets individually. Now what we're doing is we're doing continuing resolutions because they can't get any of them done. They can't even get a big one done altogether because of how onerous that process is. That's all wrong. That's not what the law is actually requiring us to do. As a member of Congress, as a member of the United States Senate, I would like to see us deal with each one of the agencies' budgets, because when you do that, not only are you passing their budget, but you're determining what programs they should or should be doing.
I think
that's a very important process,
for
and
sure.
It's missing when we don't have that budgetary process on each of the agencies.
I think it always falls into that same pile of problems where you have these ridiculous budgets for items that nobody can understand why they are. They're always laughable every year, where they're spending millions of dollars on some research project that makes no sense, and nobody would approve it if it was sitting there by itself. So because it's lumped in behind something else, it goes through. Go back to something else you talked about, climate change. How would you answer to someone who says, "Hey, from the time we started taking records of temperatures, we were coming out of a mini ice age, and there was only one direction for temperatures to go, and that was up." So the data that creates this idea of climate change, is it something that's a picture of a small moment of time where we might be exaggerating our impacts without saying that the climate protection is not a bad thing.
Right.
I think there's people that sit in the middle where I don't believe it's as dire as they've said over my entire lifetime that Florida was going to be under. I think Florida was going to be underwater by now, and it clearly isn't. The coastlines haven't changed, but at the same time, I believe in smart nuclear energy being the most efficient and cleanest way we can go forward. And watching the piles of windmill pieces and the idea that solar panels only last 30 years and they're going to be more waste than they ever saved from a climate perspective. How do you battle with that? How do you answer someone that's looking at those things that way?
So let's start with the idea that we have people who say that climate change is a hoax. A blanket denial of what's happening in the climate, I think, is just as irresponsible as somebody overreacting and saying, because of this, therefore. I come down in the middle as well. I want the science to look at it, and I do think there's some science evidence to indicate that something is going on. I don't know how long-term it is. I don't know how permanent it is. I do think there is a little bit of coastal flooding going on. Again, is it going to be permanent? Is it temporary? I don't know. I would like the science to actually dig into those questions and for us to come up with a rational response to the climate challenges that we are having. Clearly, we have stronger hurricanes. Clearly, we're having far more forest fires. Clearly, we're having very adverse weather events. Either way, whether it's a part of a bigger climate change or it's just something we're dealing with today, we need to deal with those because real people are being badly impacted by that.
For sure. I think some of those pieces, I think they do need to be delved into and in detail, because I think there's also an impact that's created based on the value of the structures that get that get damaged, and the amount of money of damage is always a skewing statistic that's used where they say, oh, there's this many more billions of damage due to climate change and due to these extreme storms, when in reality, if you take the values of that time period and put it to now and the amount of structures, we've just developed so much of our space, and we've built up and out and up and out. And of course, the storms will have more impacts if it's not just barren land. So we've increased our population, increased our density, which impacts those numbers. So there's so many different ways to look at that, and there's so much history before that we don't completely understand.
Right.
I think it's one of those where maybe the messaging is something that needs to change. And this brings us to something else that I would like to ask about is this governing by fear. Because some of the climate change piece feels like fear. And then when you get into the issues with wars, and every time we've been kind of coaxed into going across the seas to attack someone, and kill human beings, that we're always in a state of fear when we do it, and there's always a spin put on it. And sometimes I feel like climate is the same way. How do we govern without fear?
Well, as Roosevelt said, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. That's true. There's no question about that. Fear is the greatest tool that the opposition uses, whether it's Democrat, Republican, or frankly, independents alike. Socialists, communists, they all use it. It's been with us forever. You have to look at an issue and you have to decide what's real and what's not. You have to analyze it quickly, and you have to have leadership that can step up and say, this is not something for us to fear today. This is something that we need to keep our eye on, but let's move beyond it. In terms of wars, we have to stop Soviet aggression, Russian aggression, that you're seeing in the Ukraine, because it will spill over into Europe and we could fall back into another world war because of it. There's no reason that war has to continue. It should end. But by the same token, you don't give Ukraine away to the Russians to get a solution to the problem. We have terrorists that we have to deal with, clearly. So the policies that we use in our defense policy or our foreign policy, those things need to be consistent. We talked about the need for consistency. It's not there. People don't have a predictable way to judge what is a threat, what is not a threat. Is it a direct threat or is it a secondary threat? Is it a short-term threat or is it a long-term threat? We need to start analyzing those. And there are smart people in government that do it. I just don't know that there are smart people in Congress that are doing it as much as they should. Yeah. So if we can get back to that, then I think we can start to deal with some of these issues of fear and be able to dispel it. I also will tell you that I think our presidents, and I think also our senators in particular, have a responsibility to tell people this is not something you fear. This is something we need to deal with, and we can. I don't fear immigration. I don't think the country is going to be taken over, but I'm not willing to sit back and do nothing about it either. I don't think you have to fear the gangs that are coming in, because I think we have the resources in the United States to actually get rid of those gangs. Question is, will we? If we do, the fear isn't a factor. If we ignore it, then we need to be fearful.
And I think that's the biggest. I think that's one of the biggest questions is, will we? And then the other question is, why don't we?
Why don't we? Right.
And going back to Ukraine,
sure.
I feel like sometimes when I hear things and when I hear, Blinken, and Mayorkas going there, it feels more like stoking. Why would we promise decades ago not to put Ukraine in NATO? And we're like, this is a clear line. This is a clear line. And then we keep pushing it. We keep putting it out there. And it feels like you're just trying to drag them out to do something so that we can act.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people look at that and say, man, I feel like we started this one. Like maybe he wouldn't have gone anywhere if we hadn't pushed on some of these buttons. And as I look back through U.S. history and the CIA's involvement in regime change in a lot of places, it seems so probable, I'll just say probable, that we stoke some of these things, and the intentions behind them are to feed that war machine that we were warned about as JFK was coming into office. And what do we do to get a handle on that and stop allowing that control that seems to unite the parties to war?
So I have proposed a foreign policy doctrine of my own called the Three Trinity Doctrine. And it basically is 3 levels of checks at 3 different types of threat that we need to address. If we deal with our foreign policy more strategically and more realistically, we won't get ourselves into wars we don't need to be in. By the same token, it will identify for us wars that we might need to be in to stop, for example, Russian aggression into Europe. Russian aggression into Europe will eventually come to be Russian aggression in the United States. We cannot afford that. That's what the Cuban Missile Crisis was starting to turn out to be as well, that Kennedy had to deal with. The military-industrial complex that's out there is something that you need to be aware of, but a strong military is a great deterrent. I'm a big believer in having a strong deterrent through the military. But I'm also somebody who's trained in diplomacy and foreign affairs, and I believe in that process as well. I think it starts with diplomacy, and if diplomacy can't succeed, then that's when you do need to deploy your military. I'm not afraid to do that. And I don't think it's poking the bear. I think we got to tell Russia, you will not take Ukraine. You already took Crimea long before that. We're not going to allow this. It has to stop, and it stops here. I actually think that we need to take a good, hard, active look at putting Ukraine in NATO. That's the purpose of NATO. NATO is an organization that's been wildly successful for us. You can argue, as President Trump does, that they might need to pay more for their defense. But you don't get rid of NATO because there's strength in numbers, and NATO gives us strength in numbers. And it's been a very effective foreign policy and defense policy tool for the United States' needs and ambitions throughout the world.
So you brought up Cuban Missile Crisis,
sure.
and looking back at the history of that, and JFK probably saved us from World War III then.
Mm-hmm. Sure did.
And he doesn't get enough credit for that. He was lied to by his advisors. He was pushed into and bullied into that spot, and he stood strong. He did something that we're not doing now was he talked to the Soviet leader at the time,
Right.
behind the scenes, secretly.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think you'd probably get jailed for treason if he tried that, even as a president. But what do you say to the fact that Biden hasn't talked to Putin? And I don't know if he's talked to him throughout his entire presidency, is what I've always understood.
Right.
How do you manage this crisis, and how do you attempt to end that war when you can't even have a line of communication?
So let me laugh a little bit about the treason part of this, but thanks to the Supreme Court in a recent ruling, the president could not be held liable for the
and I'm
treason
glad for
because
that.
it's an official act. So, okay, we're good there.
Thanks for the clarity.
Which opens the door for talk. You have to talk. You have to talk through your Secretary of State, your foreign departments, whoever they may be. That has to happen. And if those conversations aren't going on, clearly things are going to digress very quickly into a problem. I would encourage the President of the United States, regardless of who that is and which party, that they need to have a foreign policy that is based on conversation with a clear-eyed understanding of what you're trying to accomplish. War is the last resort for us. It should be. But by the same token, when somebody pokes the bear on our end, we need to realize we're being poked, and we need to realize what that means, and we need to understand in the context of the bigger story, where does that fit in with what we're trying to do as a country to stay safe and secure.
When I'm criticizing both sides, I would turn to you and say, hey, Biden's unwillingness to speak seems very isolationist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The exact thing that they say they're against.
Right.
And I think that sometimes the hypocrisy of the actions versus what they're accusing others of or claiming they're against is one of the things that's so in our face and so frustrating that we feel, wow, do they really think we're this ignorant to not see through some of that? And, when we talked back about Reagan, you knew what he was going to do. He was going to tell you what he was going to do, and he was going to stand behind it.
Sure.
I feel like now we've got very much I'm going to tell you what I'm all about, and then I'm going to go do the other.
So I'm going to paraphrase this great play called Hamilton that Lin-Manuel Miranda did. In that he was saying to Hamilton, smile more, talk less. I think you need to smile more and talk more. And our presidents need to be encouraged by members of the U.S. Senate to do exactly that. We shouldn't be attacking them because they did do it. We should be really beating them up over the fact that they didn't try. And I don't care what party you are. And the beauty of being an independent is I probably won't have an independent president to be worried about. But I'm going to be encouraging them, get out there, let's talk, let's have diplomacy, let's see if we can find some solutions. And that includes China as well. We've got a problem with China. We don't need to attack each other, but we definitely need to have a lot more conversation. By the same token, I will tell you that as far as Iran's concerned, I think Iran's at war with the West. I think Iran's at war with the United States.
And
I think we're stupid if we don't recognize that reality when you look at the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas and everything that's going on in the Middle East. We are being attacked every day. And we have to stand up to that. And that's one of those things where you don't poke the bear back, but you do carry that big stick.
Yeah, I think, and I think it's another great example of some of our misactions and missteps and lack of communication. I feel like we've isolated ourselves so much from the places that we have risk with,
Right.
that we only want to talk to our friends, right? I feel like social media has done the same thing. It's interesting. It's almost like it's representative of our society, where we've got friends. I unfriend you, I cancel you because you don't agree with me, and I'm going to silo myself. And it feels like the administration has siloed itself, where I'm only going to talk to France. I'm going to talk to, and I'm a little shaky with over here, but I'm definitely not going to talk to those guys, because if I talk to them, I'm going to look like I like them, and I can't make a demon out of a country that I'm talking to. And we're dehumanizing each other in the world the same way we don't want to dehumanize each other locally. But the actions continually represent the dehumanization of anyone that opposes.
Right.
We just need to continue to talk, whether it's as a society, as our population, as Florida, as the U.S., and globally. If we stop talking, the enemies are going to form whether we want them to or not.
You're absolutely right. The enemies will form if we stop talking. So the challenge is talk. Talk more, talk as often as we can, talk to as many people as we can. That hasn't been happening. So
No.
if we can get past that, then we might have a chance to make things work better.
Great. I won't block you on social media.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. So when we talk about the things that are going on in Looking for America, I'm going to ask you a cultural question.
Sure.
Really put you on the spot. What song is bouncing around in your head right now that you can remember most?
What song? Probably Into the Mystic by Van Morrison.
Okay, interesting. Why?
I love that song. It's a mellowing song with all the stress and things in the world. It's one of those songs that just feels good. It's about letting go and just appreciating all the great things in life. So what song would you think of right now?
So I think it would be also a song from Hamilton. It's the song "Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story?"
Interesting. Why?
Because we're here to tell a story about America.
Well, I hope I live. I hope you live.
Super.
Thank you.
Good talking to you.
Good talking
a lot
to
of
you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. So, folks, this is why we're doing this podcast, because we know we've got to keep talking. We got to talk about the issues. We got to talk about the problems. We got to talk about the solutions. We are off to a great start. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for being a part of Looking for America.